Resident Evil.
Welcome back to the Survival Horror Power Hour, and today we'll be doing a true score review on the original Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. It's been a little while since we last looked into this franchise, but that's just because new release games take precedent over reviewing older games, and I'm not currently playing any new releases. That being said, Days Gone just came out on PC, so comment below if you think I should play and review that. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis takes place smack bang in the middle of the Raccoon City incident that you saw in the last game. You play as STARS member Jill Valentine, who returns from the first game. After the events of the first game, STARS have made it their mission to expose Umbrella's evil actions, but as we saw in Resident Evil 2, they've been cockblocked by Chief Irons at every step. Jill was one of the few remaining members in Raccoon City, which kinda sucks for her, as Umbrella decided to send their ultimate bioweapon her way. This game was actually meant to be just a spin-off, with the game we know as Code Veronica having meant to be the real Resident Evil 3, but due to a troubled development and console switch, Capcom made the decision to make this the official third entry in the franchise. This means that the game has several changes to the gameplay compared to the first two games, so let's take a look at what works and what doesn't. Let's take a look at the story and characters first. It's actually really neat to have a game that takes place pretty much at the start of the Raccoon City outbreak. In Resident Evil 2, we only saw a very small glimpse of what the city looked like, as most of the time was spent in the RPD and underground. The story itself is pretty bare bones. Since we've already seen and read about the outbreak in the last game, they don't waste any time on it. The game focuses solely on Jill being trapped in the city and about how she escapes. As per usual, there is a small supporting cast that Jill interacts with during her escape. The interesting thing about this is that almost all the supporting cast are actually made up of a small mercenary group working for Umbrella that may or may not be there to help evacuate civilians. In this group is your other main character.
What's that?
Calm down, lady. I'm no zombie. My name's Carlos, Corporal of Umbrella's Biohazard Countermeasure Force. What's your name?
Jill, did you just say you belong to Umbrella's army?
The merc with the heart of gold, Carlos Oliveira. Jill and Carlos actually have a pretty cool dynamic, and their friendship is really one of the only interesting parts of the story. The only other part of the story is that, as I mentioned earlier, Umbrella have sent out a prototype tyrant called the Nemesis. Nemesis' sole purpose for living is to hunt down each and every member of STARS, and is a noticeable step up for Umbrella, seeing as he is capable of free thought, able to use weapons, can speak in a somewhat limited capacity, and can even change his goals as he sees fit. Resident Evil games haven't exactly had the most fleshed out stories, so it might seem a little strange that I was let down by it in this game, but I feel like it's mainly because a lot of the backstory and info is usually presented in diaries and notes, and this game had a real lack of them. I would have loved if there was more documentation on the Nemesis itself, and about the goal to use him to hunt down STARS members, but there really isn't. Now to talk about the gameplay, and this is where the bulk of things to talk about this game are. I won't go into much detail on what you do in this game, since you can check out my RE1 and 2 reviews if you want to know. You just go through areas killing zombies and stuff, picking up health, ammo and items to solve puzzles. It's very apparent right from the start of the game that this is a much more action focused experience. Jill moves faster than any previous characters, has a 180 degree quick turn if you press backwards and sprint, and can now run upstairs without hitting the action button, which feels really seamless. As a trade-off for this, zombies are a lot more mobile. Since these are fresh zombies that are only just infected, they move at a damn breakneck pace, nearly breaking out at a run to get at you. This feels like a really natural progression of the gameplay, and I have no complaints about any of the movement or weapons except for one other new addition. They added in a dodge mechanic, where if you hit the action button just as the enemy hits you, Jill dodges it out of the way so you can get a few more shots in or get a chance to make some distance. It's a good idea in theory, but in practice, the timing is really weird and rarely ever works as intended. The Nemesis fights feel like they're based around you mastering this mechanic, but the only time it worked for me was when I was mashing the shoot button and it just happened by chance. Another major shake-up to the formula is the gunpowder system. In order for players to have more customization and play the game the way they want to play, this game has a lot less of the traditional ammo pickups and opts to have two kinds of gunpowder you can find. You can use these on their own with the ammo maker to make your traditional handgun or shotgun rounds, but the possibilities don't stop there. there are a surprisingly high amount of things you can do with different combinations, like making grenade rounds, flame rounds and acid rounds, freeze rounds and even magnum rounds. This might sound like a cool system that allows for a lot of replayability, but honestly, I wasn't much of a fan and would have preferred to just have more points for traditional ammo pickups. Certain bosses are weak to certain kinds of rounds, and if you're not aware of this, it's super easy to make the wrong ammo types and create a bit of a progress wall. The puzzle design in this game is also a bit of a disappointment. Instead of puzzles that require logic and clues to work out the answers to, the ones in this game seem to almost all be more of like a trial and error type. Now I'd like to take a minute to talk about Nemesis himself. Nemesis is like Mr. X from RE2 on steroids and chases you through pretty much the entirety of the game. Seeing as his name is the subtitle of the game, you can probably tell that he's the best part of it. Mr. X only shows up a handful of times in RE2, and when he did, you could just run past him out of the next door to make him despawn, but that ain't gonna work for old Nemmy here. Nemesis is actually a real threat. He shows up in a lot of the game, and really does hunt you down. You run into the next room, he's either going to run in after you, or already be in there ready to mess you up. His attacks are really deadly too. If you're on yellow health and get grabbed by him, guess what? Game over, try again, loser. He's also capable of running nearly faster than you can and has ranged attacks. They did an amazing job when making this game to make him not only a real threat, but genuinely scary, which is why I'm sad to say that fighting him is one of my least favourite parts of the game. There are more than a few occasions that you can choose to fight him or run away, and I run away every time. The areas you can fight him in are really tight, which is good for making sure that you can't run past him, but if you want to fight, then his hits take up the entire walkways, and it is so difficult to avoid his grabs. That, coupled with his enormous health, meant that the only times I ever fought him were the times where it's mandatory, and I didn't enjoy those fights at all. There are one or two other boss fights in the game, and I gotta be honest, I didn't enjoy those either. The next shake up to the gameplay is thankfully one that I really enjoyed, and it's the new system during cutscenes that allow you to make live choices that actually affect gameplay and story progression. The first time you encounter Nemesis is when this system shows itself, and gives you the option to either run into the next area or take on the tyrant. This system shows up more than a few times, and I like how much it lends to replayability. The next and final update to the gameplay also lends itself to replayability well, and it's that the game actually has some light roguelike elements to it. Once you beat and memorise the previous games, they tend to become incredibly easy since you can practice optimum paths, but nearly everything you do in this game actually changes the majority of the enemy encounters. Weapon usage, story choices, and area pathing can all change what enemies spawn in what rooms, meaning that you can never really prepare for what's coming. Now I want to move on to the setting and tone. The first half of the game takes place in the Raccoon City streets, and I love that so much time is spent there. After seeing the chaos in the intro to RE2, it's so cool to actually spend a fair amount of time in it. Speaking of RE2, there is a really cool throwback that I won't spoil, but I love when things like that happen in games. With the more thrilling setting and more action-focused combat, the game does lose a lot of its horror atmosphere for most of the game, with Nemesis thankfully being the one major thing to make you feel nervous opening that next door. The music isn't as haunting this time around either, but goes for a more oppressing atmosphere, which still works well. Seeing as this was a kind of impromptu sequel to Resident Evil 2 and was put together in only a few months, this isn't a super long game. You'll get about 6 to 8 hours out of your first playthrough, and the variety in the game I mentioned earlier is used as its main replay value compared to the previous games, which had alternate playthroughs as other characters. This game does have 2 slightly different endings, and if you play on the intended hard mode, you'll unlock up to 8 short text epilogues about every main character, one for each time the game has been beaten. All in all, I did think this was a pretty enjoyable game, but I will be honest, I didn't like it as much as the first or second game. It's not that it's a bad game, it's not, it's just that there are a lot of new systems that didn't really vibe with my tastes. Resident Evil 3 is a lot more difficult than the previous games, so if you feel like those are too easy for you, then you might really enjoy this one. I'm glad to be able to say that I finally have the original trilogy under my belt. It's time for the ranking now, and I'll be giving Resident Evil 3 Nemesis a true score of 8 out of 10. It hits well for the most part and is a well put together game, but it's just not as much for me as the other games. I'm pretty keen to be moving on to Code Veronica next, and every game beaten is one step closer to replaying RE4. That's going to be about it from me, guys. If you agree with my score, hit like. If you disagree, chuck us a dislike. And if you enjoyed the video, I would really appreciate subscribing. I put up game reviews just about every week, and you don't want to miss out. Alrighty guys, catch ya.
Wait, I have to ask you something.
I know. You want to ask me out? All the foxy ladies love my accent. It drives them crazy.
What? Keep dreaming.